Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome back. So, you're hard at work on your research designs, and I've spoken with many of you about what you're doing and what you're up to, and I'm very excited with what you have going. A lot of really interesting ideas, a lot of fun work going on. You've got a lot of interesting insights. This is exactly what we want, and I'm very excited to see what you wind up with. I thought that the best way for us to do today is to kind of treat it like a writing workshop. And there have been many questions about how to sort of organize and go about writing this, and maybe in particular about like what the introduction might look like. And these are all good questions. So what we're going to do today is I thought it would be useful for me to just kind of give you an example of how I would go about doing this. Now, you don't have to do what I would do, but it might be notable or helpful to see what a strategy could look like or how you might go about approaching this. Many of you have asked questions about how to refine your research question or how to think about a hypothesis that might help you to grapple with that question. And I'm here to tell you that there are ways of doing this and you have some choices, but it's always helpful to see an example. And so I think that what I'm going to do today is just walk through it. And I thought that I would really kind of like write a first paragraph and I would model what it looks like to write this paragraph and how you could go about doing this yourself if you want to produce a succinct and crisp and very informative and straight to the point opening paragraph. So, what we'll do is we'll take a look at the 5 things that I said all research designs must have. As a reminder, I told you that the research design must form a research question that relates directly to the course content. I gave you a long list of different topics and different sources of or kinds of variation across different topics that could serve as the starting point for a question. Second, I ask you to briefly review the relevant literature. 2 or 3 articles. All I want you to do is make some effort to incorporate and remark on existing work. This might be the part that's more challenging than the other part, but I don't want you to overthink it. 2 or 3 articles is probably sufficient. I don't think that you need to cite everything that's been written on the topic. Third, you want to form a hypothesis that attempts to answer the research question. This is that independent variable that you believe causes or shapes variation in your topic of interest. And so if you're trying to explain why some countries choose proportional representation electoral systems while other countries choose majoritarian electoral systems, what is the independent variable that varies with that variation in choice? That's all. You just want to identify the cause of that variation. In turn, I want you to discuss the method that you would use to test that hypothesis. So I taught you comparative methods, the method of agreement and the method of difference. These methods are very useful because they provide you a strategy that you can apply in the case of any hypothesis to test it with just a few cases. And it's a starting point for supporting and developing a larger theory that you might eventually test in a larger data set. But in addition to discussing which method you would use, I want you to talk about, well, what are the key variables? And so you should have already highlighted those by virtue of talking about your approach. And it should be evident in your hypothesis as well as in your research question what those variables are. And then finally, the cases. So if you've chosen the method of difference or the method of agreement, presumably there are a couple cases that you've got in mind that you might look at and use to test the validity of that hypothesis. And then finally, where would you potentially get the information that you would use to test that hypothesis, to actually carry out the process? And it could be a variety of different types of sources. The good thing is you don't necessarily need to obtain the data. Now, if you're really interested in doing your question and you want to actually do some preliminary analysis, be my guest. I don't want to stop you. But the legwork of any research project is always the collection of the data and the analysis of the data, because so much can change. And so really what's fun about our research design is that we take ourselves all the way up to that point where the real work would begin, and then we stop short so that we could do the research later as part of some other effort. But we don't, send ourselves through the process of doing that entire research. Now, I encourage you to do that and carry out that research later in some other circumstance if you want, and I would be happy to support you. But don't worry, you don't need to do that now. The goal with this is to just design something that is a conceivable strategy that you could use to test or explore that question in that line of reasoning that you develop. So let me begin to show you what this might look like before I write an example opening paragraph. So form a research question that relates directly to the course content. So what do I like? Oh, we got a question here. Let me check it. That's right, Alika. I want you to notice, though, that between these different components of the paper, there's quite a bit there. So 8 to 10 pages might seem like a great deal, but I think you'll notice that each of these individual sections will take up a fair bit. So hang with me. I don't want anyone to be too concerned about that number, but nevertheless, I recognize that it may be a scary prospect, but see me through. My topic of interest is legislative powers. Remember that we studied the Legislative Powers Index, which is an index used to measure the strength in the formal powers of the legislature in a given country. And we can use it to compare countries in terms of to what degree they have vested power in the legislature. So my question is, why do some countries give their legislatures more powers than others? And you know what? Here, I'm going to narrow it down. Why do some new democracies give their legislatures more power than others? Okay, great. So the question taps into the variation between countries in the strength of the legislature. That's an institutional variation. Some legislatures are stronger than others. Why? What explains that? Why would it be that one new democracy designs their legislature to be relatively powerful relative to the executive, while another new democracy designs their legislature to be relatively weak compared to the executive? What could explain that variation? Why did those countries go opposite ways? Now, I'm not going to review the literature right here on the spot, because that might take me a bit of a minute. But what I would do is I would ask, what are the existing explanations for institutional choice in new democracies? What have other scholars said could explain the variation? So that's where we begin to go out, and we're just trying to find out what other scholars have said. How have they addressed this question? And so we then go out and we look for some existing work on that subject. And so actually, let me bring up a page and show you what I would go through to find mine. And that can give you a sense of what that would involve. Hold on just a second. So we can go to Google Scholar. Okay, so I've got a number of options here. First thing that comes up is a book by Leipart on institutional design and new democracies, Eastern Europe and Latin America. I could view part of that at Google Books by opening it up and reading probably the introduction as well as the other parts of the book that might tell me a little bit about what their argument is. Interesting, I could use that. Here's another article on institutional choice in new democracies, bargaining over Hungary's 1989 electoral law. Here's another one by Leipart from 1991. As you can see, there are a number of different articles that seem to address this issue. Legislative institutional design. Let's see. So here's an article that I could use. I could use all these articles. My point that I want to make to you is that these articles, although they may seem very specific and you might worry that they're not related to what you want to investigate, I want you to be more open to the possibility that they are, because really, institutional design is a relatively broad question. And all you need to do is show me that you're looking at some existing explanations of institutional design. If this were your question, whatever your question is, there are going to be a variety of different existing perspectives on that question. And I just want you to engage with 2 or 3 of them at most. So take a look at this. This is Gabriel Negretto, who I actually know and cite in some of my other work. He's addressing political parties and institutional design, explaining constitutional choice in Latin America. The formulas for electing presidents and the rules determining the legislative powers of presidents are important variables for explaining the performance of presidential democracies. Boom. The legislative powers of presidents have a direct relation to the legislative powers of legislatures. So what's advanced in this article would also be relevant to my analysis and my literature review in my paper. And so you can use these articles in productive and in creative ways. Don't feel too siloed or bound up or tied by these articles or by the books that seem to have a relation to what you're studying. There really is a crossover there. I'm almost certain, as long as you're addressing the key topic or the key issue. And in this case, again, my question has to do with institutional design. So it makes sense that I would look at this article. But let me go back to our process here, and I'll continue doing this. This is a question about institutional design. So I could use Negretto, Leipart, and others to engage these questions. Okay, great. Now, let's go to the third part. This is where we ask the question, well, what could potentially explain why some new democracies give their legislatures more powers than others? Well, I've got a hypothesis. And my hypothesis is that the key variable is the authoritarians' expectations. And hear me out. I'm just spitballing here, but let me explain. So my theory is that when the outgoing authoritarian leaders expect that they will be electoral losers, that their side will be the electoral losers under democracy, the authoritarian leaders will craft institutions that give the, hold on, let me make this simpler, will that give the legislature less powers. Why? Because if the authoritarian leaders are the electoral losers under democracy, that means that they want to weaken the legislature as much as possible, since the legislature is going to be the locus of the democratic movement and the democratic reforms that might come into play after the transition to democracy. So the authoritarian leaders are going to try to restrain and weaken that democratic institution as much as possible so that they can prevent changes in policy that would be antagonistic to the legacy or the interests of the authoritarian leaders or the party. Now, I hope that makes sense to you all, but that's only one side of my hypothesis. The other side of my hypothesis is this. When the outgoing authoritarian leaders expect that their side will be the electoral winners under democracy, the authoritarian leaders will craft constitutions that grant the legislature more powers. Why? Because if they're the electoral winners, they will control the legislature, in which case they want the legislature to have considerable powers so that they can hold their policies in place and so that they can prevent any changes to policy that would eliminate or alter the legacy of the authoritarian regime. So my point is that the key variable is authoritarians' expectations. The argument is that legislative powers, that powers granted to the legislature will vary with the expectations of the outgoing authoritarian leadership. Does that hypothesis make sense? Does anyone not see the logic there? I'm just sort of brainstorming, right? I'm just spitballing. I'm trying to think about, well, what reasons would what reasons would the authoritarians have to create a weak legislature? And what reasons would they have to create a strong legislature? Well, it might have to do with whether they expect themselves to control the legislature or not. If they don't control the legislature, well, you would want to weaken the legislature. But if you do control the legislature, you would want to strengthen the legislature. And so that's the hypothesis that I would test. And I would try to develop a research design that could test that. Yes, Kiana, I can address that. So Kiana's asking, when we address the question, why its approaches do not work, what are we actually doing? Well, what we're doing is we're basically saying, look, if I assume for hypothetical purposes that this existing explanation is true, well, what aspect of my outcome of interest does it not explain? Or what part of reality do the existing explanations assume is always the same that is not actually the same? In other words, what with regard to my topic varies that the literature does not acknowledge varies? So what this really means, what we're saying is, what do those explanations not explain? Think about what you're studying. What parts of it do the existing explanations leave unturned or unexplained? What do they fail to shed light on? And that's the opening or the space that is created for your approach, right? Your hypothesis then stands in for those existing explanations and does the work that those explanations cannot do. Now, this leaves it up to you to highlight what limitations of those existing arguments exist. And there might be many limitations. One thing that I like to do is I like to look for hidden assumptions. What theory is needed to better explain the entire nature of the outcome? Yes, Jeffrey, you need to be using outside sources. Are there any questions at this point? Are there any questions about how to go about reviewing the relevant literature? Does this help to shed a little more light on how to approach that part? It is a hard part, I acknowledge, but we all have to write literature reviews. And so we all do this, and it just has to do with how can we critique the existing arguments? Why do its approaches not work for your analysis? What are the parts of your outcome or your variable, the outcome, that are not explained or that still need explaining? So I've got my hypothesis regarding the authoritarian's expectations. Now, what is my method? Well, I'm going to use the method of difference. Compare cases with different outcomes but similar attributes. What explains the variation in the outcome? Case 1, Chile. Weak legislature. Authoritarians expected them to be the electoral. Hold on, let me put that differently. So my first case is Chile, case of a weak legislature, and the authoritarian expectation was one of electoral loss. They expected themselves to be the electoral losers when they returned to democracy in Chile. And that's one reason why the military regime or the dictatorship substantially weakened the legislature and strengthened the executive. And it also explains why they created a number of supermajority requirements for changing key organic constitutional laws that the military had imposed under military rule. So that's one case. The second case would be, say, the second case that I'm going to go with is I'll go with Brazil. I'm just kind of spitballing here. So there I have my comparative design, my cases configured on those key variables. Now, where would I get my data? Where would I get this stuff? Well, I would use secondary literature. Existing studies on democratic transitions and constitution making in new democracies. I would also classified intelligence documents through the CIA and others, I would access okay. Like is asking if we are doing method of difference or agreement, should we go in depth about our cases? Yeah, go into a little bit of depth, highlighting why the method is appropriate for those cases. So if there are two cases that have similar attributes and different outcomes, identify a few of those attributes that make them similar. And of course, make sure to discuss the difference in the outcome. If you're using method of agreement, highlight the similar attributes, or the different attributes, excuse me, and then the similarity in the outcome. But you don't need to go into too much detail. Just show me that you thought about the cases enough to form a configurative study or design, case study design that could be useful. Efren asks, I'm still confused on what sources of data could be used. I'm just asking, where would you get the empirical information that you would use to evaluate your hypothesis? Are you going to be relying on newspapers or secondary sources? Are you going to be reading certain kinds of documents to get this information? Where would you get it if you actually went out and sought out that information? Where would you find that information? And that's the key question here. Jeffrey, review the difference between the method of difference and the method of agreement. That was on the midterm, and I taught you those in the first half of the class. So I'll encourage you to go back. The key difference is that they isolate on different configurations of similarity and difference in order to test hypotheses. But I do want you to go back and review that if you need to review that. But we did cover that a great deal. Yes, you can use reading from the class, Kimberly, but you need to make an effort to seek out readings outside of the course. This primarily needs to exhibit an individual initiative. So it's a research design. You don't want to rely on the readings from the class. You need to demonstrate some effort to obtain outside sources and engage with this literature in at least a minimal way. And that means that you'll have to take a peek. And you can start with some of the readings from the class, but I really would encourage you to try to branch out and not rely on those, because the assignment requires you to demonstrate some individual initiative and to go beyond material from the course. But there is a good place to start normally in most of these readings that I assigned, because we do cover the full range of the issues. So you can oftentimes figure out, okay, well, what readings might I go look for by taking a look at the references in the works that I assign you. So that's good. That's a good way to use the readings, but don't ultimately rely on them too much. In terms of the outside sources that you use, when you talk about the literature review, you of course do need to be, referring to the literature, right? Those 2 or 3 articles that you find, but the information, the empirical evidence that you seek out, you can be using a variety of different sources to get that. You can be using secondary sources and articles. You can be using newspapers and primary sources. It just depends on where you choose to look. And I would encourage anyone to look widely for that information, because really the value of academic secondary sources is that they've been vetted already. It's already been through the ringer in terms of academic peer review. And so there's really no equal in terms of the depth and the sophistication of detail that you can usually get in existing articles and books and stuff like that. Of course, Kimberly, absolutely, you can use both, but it's good that we clarify. Jocelyn, you can include assigned readings if you want. I'm just saying that you want to, above all, demonstrate that you've kind of gone outside of the course material. And so if you can use the course reading in a way that is useful for you and that connects directly to your topic, that's a good starting point, but you want to go outside of that ultimately. So you can cite it from the class if that helps as a starting point, but I don't want that to be the end. Yeah, just branch out. Oscar says for section 5, discuss the sources of data could be used. We only need to explain where we would look to support our hypothesis. but we need what? But do we need to do the actual research? No, Oscar, you don't need to do the actual research. Just talk about where you would get it. Where would you get, or where would you look for it if you needed to get it? So let me write a first paragraph for you. I want to show you what an opening paragraph might look like in an approach that could be used if you chose to. So this is going to be very casual, and don't get don't get too worried about that first paragraph because you always go back and change it. But if my topic is legislative powers, I would begin by saying research has shown that stronger legislatures promote democratic consolidation. This is important because it has implications for democratic survival and economic policy reform. Existing studies have focused on the political effects of legislative strength. However, there are important questions. Hold on. Important questions remain. Important questions about why countries However, important questions about why some new democracies create stronger legislatures than others remain. This research design proposes an analytical, a research strategy for analyzing variation in legislative strength. So this is what I have so far. I'm going to pause right here, and Sophia asks, and you will be posting this example for reference, correct? I will be posting it, yes. So we'll stop here. Now what do I need to do? I'm not done with it yet, but what do I need to do now? So I've sort of begun to set up the premise and the question and what we're doing, right? But where do I go now? Anyone? What do I do now? Jake says thesis. Nina says list the variables. Jeffrey says offer examples. Kayana says form the question. Karen says literature review. Santiago says research method. Kimberly says review the relevant literature. So we do need to have the thesis, right? We're not quite done with the introduction of the paper. So at this point, we need to do a couple more things in the introduction. And I would also agree with Kayana, who says, well, you need to form the question, right? And that is true. Even though I've sort of stated the implicit question, we want to go ahead and come out with it and say, for example, no, we'll go. Namely, why do some new democracies, oh, hold on, we'll go back. Why do some countries grant more powers to the legislature than other countries? So that's the question, right? This research design proposes a research strategy for analyzing variation in formal legislative powers. I argue that variation in the authoritarians' expectations regarding their electoral performance contribute to variation to hold on to divergent to the divergent outcomes. I argue that variation in the authoritarians' expectations regarding their electoral performance contribute to the divergent outcomes. That and that this can be corroborated through a comparative analysis, through a small n comparative analysis of the cases of Chile and Brazil. In particular, this last part is maybe extra, but I will state it because I think it might be useful, where the authoritarians expect themselves to be electoral losers, fewer powers hold on, let me do this way. Where the authoritarians expect themselves to be the electoral winners, legislatures will be granted more powers. Where the authoritarians expect themselves to be the electoral losers, legislatures, actually I usually do it this way with the second hypothesis. Legislatures will be granted fewer powers where the authoritarians expect themselves to be the electoral losers. This because it affects in economic policy. Existing studies have focused on the political effects of legislative strength. So there you go. That is an example of a introductory paragraph, and you can do something similar. I'm going to go out and tell you that you probably don't necessarily need this. In truth, the thesis is really right here. This is the thesis right here. That is the thesis. But this is obviously the hypothesis, right? These are the two hypotheses that follow from my argument. And because we value clarity and because we want to be very, very clear about what exactly the variation is of importance, it might be useful for you to include your hypothesis, but you don't need to, right? As long as it's clear in the paper, that's fine. But you might want to plug in the hypotheses after the thesis. Now, is it clear to everyone that this is the thesis? Do we see why that is the thesis? Efren, yes, you can write in first person. You can use I. So this is the thesis, and it's the thesis because it states my argument, my argument is an answer to the question, right? The question is, why do some countries grant more powers to the legislature than others? Argument is that variation in authoritarians' expectations regarding their electoral performance contribute to the divergent outcomes. And this can be corroborated through a small and comparative analysis of the cases of Chile and Brazil. You might even add, yeah, that should be sufficient. And then what would we do next? Well, next we would do the following. We would go, so here's our introduction. And actually, a lot of you have asked, how should I format my paper? Well, here's a way to do it. You can go like this. And you can go like this. Hypothesis. Then you want to discuss the method. Methodology and cases. And then finally, you want to address data and then you want to write the conclusion where you restate and sort of reiterate the argument and you kind of begin to discuss the broader significance. And there are always good questions about what to include in the conclusion. And what I find is a good way to approach the conclusion is thinking about the implications. You might ask yourself, what are the analytical and political implications of my argument? If true. Restate thesis. Kimberly is asking if you need to include an abstract. It's not necessary. It's not necessary. Your introduction sort of functions as a bit of an abstract because it addresses a lot of the same issues. Jocelyn says, well, we need to format it like this, like with the numbers and heading. No, not necessarily, but it's useful, I think, to think of it this way because a research design conventionally does include these key issues, right? You introduce a brief literature review, a hypothesis. Of course, this follows on the question. You know what? Actually, hold on, everyone. I think that if I'm going back, you might want to do this. But do you need to do it like this? No, you don't need to do it like this if you don't want to. But if it's helpful to you, go for it. Because really a research design it's pretty surgical. You know, we know exactly what we need, how we need to set up the study if we are potentially going to do it. In that way, it's a nice guide. It can help you to organize your response to the prompt. Alika asks, can our question just be in your introduction? Yeah, it can. It can. If you find that you don't need to have a section for the question, don't worry about it. But if you want to elaborate on the question and talk about why it's an important question or what is the nature of the inquiry, that's okay. You know, I don't discourage you from doing that because, above all, when we develop a research design, we want to form something that is clear and crisp, right? And that ideally could be replicated or done pretty easily if we actually turned around and conducted the research. Jeffrey asks, can you expand on what brief literature review means again? A brief literature review, Jeffrey, means that you are briefly considering how existing explanations work. What are the existing answers to the research question? How have scholars before you answered your question? So if you're asking, why does one country choose presidentialism when another chooses parliamentary democracy? Well, what are the existing explanations, or what have scholars before you argued explains that variation? And so you want to engage, at least in a minimal way, with some of those existing explanations. You need to make some effort to consider those explanations. All right. You need to situate your research design in that, because what we are fundamentally doing when we do research is we're engaging in a social scientific enterprise where we are taking and carrying out research that others could do as well. And so we are engaging with their explanations and having a discussion with other scholars who've addressed this question too. Now, we're out of time, everyone, but I hope that this was useful for you. I know that this is an assignment that many of you are working very hard on. And so I'll go ahead and post this, and you can use it as a format or a template, and you can ask me any questions you want. Come in and see me or send me an email. Getting a lot of it these days, so I'll do my best to respond in a timely fashion, but I'm happy to help you. So reach out to me, and I look forward to hearing from you. But for now, I'll let you go, and I'll see you on Friday. Thanks, everybody. Great to see you. Have a good one. Oh, yes, Alika, there is. We'll review for that on Friday. Yep, no problem.